It sounds like a big title, philosophy, with loaded implications. But please consider the subtitle, The Journeys of Displacement. At least it would help us hold the storyline together. In this short presentation, the idea is to frame or come up with a different view or a new lens on how to look at Eritrea. You know, Eritrea's history didn't begin or start in 1961. Sometimes it's better to see Eritrea as a political map that was drawn in 1889. Unfortunately, the Eritrean people, or the map of Eritrea that contains the Eritrean people, they always come second or third, depending where they find themselves in the hierarchies of power. In other words, you see, the storyline of Eritrea is about how the people of Eritrea were displaced from their base and their resources by every successive displacer, including people of their own kind. So in this presentation, we are going to look into that displacement in itself, and how the idea of settlement is absent along the line. The origins of this paper are from a series of articles written under the title of Analyze Asmara. That was in 2010. And basically that deals with, again, the idea of the phenomenon of displacement triggered by Asmara on the locals and in the wider areas of Eritrea. So it's the displacement actually takes shape before Asmara. Long before Asmara, probably 20 years before Asmara. But that is where it becomes, that's where its impact becomes visible in the psychological, cultural, or physical sense. If there is such a thing called cultural tsunami, I think Asmara would represent that phenomenon from its very inception. It was Analyze Asmara that actually opened up my understanding of the gravity of the city brought on the cultural displacements of the people of Eritrea in general. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to to go into the details of that storyline or of that storyline. It would be a good idea to refer to that in relation to this paper. Now, these two are the two important words I came up with to cover or to frame the storyline of Eritrea. Normally, when we talk about Eritrea, we talk about the armed struggle for independence, which started in 1961. But the bigger picture is actually found by these two frames of reference, the settlement and the displacement. And these two are the main threads that hold together or bind the storyline of Eritrea. Displacement and settlement. And under these two, we have Asmara as a part under displacement, and the successive stories from 1896 up to 2020, really. And these are the two, Asmara and the wars across a century that informed and actually deformed Eritrea and its people. So this is what I want to focus on and look at Eritrea's history or storyline with a new set of lenses. Right. Now, let's have a look at this photo now. Let me see two images. Three, actually. The photo on the left is actually that of Asmara, probably around 1900. The one on the right is that of Asmara, probably 30 to 40 years later. The point I'm trying to make here is just to imagine the cultural and the psychological impact the society can come under with that kind of culture imposed, not only on those cultures around Asmara or in Asmara, but in the wider parts of Eritrea. Is unimaginable in the sense that one has to be culturally displaced to accommodate this change. And it's not only that, the impact we will have on the coming generations should also be taken into consideration here. Yeah, this is the area actually that was explored in greater detail in Analyze Asmara. What can be said at this stage is just to imagine having a city, a town, a proper Italian town, as if it landed from outer space, really. And I mean, for someone in Eritrea, a local person in Eritrea, to see that city within a 1 hour drive or 70 kilometers distance from the city. A person arriving in Asmara, say in the 1930s, would literally be in one of the cities in Europe within a 70-kilometer distance. And the displacement it can cause, or it caused, on so many Eritreans at that time and their generations in the coming decades is something that is still affecting the people of Eritrea as a whole. But like I said, this is discussed in much more detail in another document. Now this is more or less same picture, same city of Asmara on the right, and on the left we have a settlement or housing for the soldiers that used to fight in all sorts of wars. And you can compare and contrast what Asmara looks like and what the settlement of surrounding areas near Asmara look like. When we can see the contrast of displacement here, of local population displaced in their own surrounding, in their own base. And this is just not for surrounding areas in Asmara, it is repeated in other parts of Eritrea as well. So this is just the idea is to impress or to bring up this pattern of displacement that were happening all over Eritrea and that were building up in creating that psychological or cultural displacement of the people. Now we come to second feature of the displacement bit that was affecting the peoples of Eritrea from 1890 practically up to now. Now this is the war bit. So we have 1896, which is the Battle of Adwa, and this is the top left. There is Eritrean soldiers coming back from Adwa with left leg and right hand amputated. And you have a 1911, that is Eritreans in Tripoli, Libya. And then you have Eritreans in 1937, when the Italian army invaded Ethiopia. And then you have the cemetery of the unknown soldier of Eritreans who died in the Battle of Keren, fighting the Allied forces with the Italian army, of course, in 1941. So here we have at least 4 generations of Eritreans taking part in 4 big wars under the Italian army over a span of about 45 years. And here we have another 3 generations of Eritreans at war, serving, fighting a war. That started in 1961, ended in 1991, with 1 more or 2 more, shall we say, or at least 1 more, 1998. And if you are the recent one, the one that happened in 2020, we have at least 4 generations of Eritreans participating in a war in a period of how many years now? 60 years. We will come into more detail in the next slide. Now we have this generation of wars here in more detail. This is actually the one I find truly disturbing, actually. Now let's begin. Now let's count the wars here. How many wars have we got here? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we might have, we do have 2 wars here. I mean, 2 wars as in 2 generations. So it's a war where you have 2 generations of Eritreans in a period, in a time span of 70 years. Yeah. Now, just to give you some perspective here, I went into the story of my own family, and I could see that my great-grandfather was alive during this period, although he didn't take part in the Battle of Adwa, but he was alive then. My grandfather was part of the Italian army who invaded Libya. Yeah. My uncle in 1935 was one of the European soldiers under the Italian army who invaded Ethiopia. And possibly another uncle, potentially, could have been involved when the battle between the Allied force and the Italian army was taking place in 1941. The possibility is there. If the uncle wasn't there, I'm sure people of his age would have been there, would have been part of the war. Yeah? And now, the reason I have 1977 is the middle year between 1961 and 1991. But you have at least 2 generations of Eritrea. In one of them, my eldest brother was in one of them. And after independence, we have the Badima War, the war with Ethiopia. And my youngest brother was there. And in 2020, when Eritrea was involved in the Ethiopian war, my nephew and my niece could have been there potentially, they know left Eritrea back in 2018, 2019. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 consecutive generations of Eritreans across a period of about 120 years getting involved in wars that keep on coming again and again and again. And this is the part of the displacement that cannot be ignored. And all is done in the name of Eritrea. So what I need to emphasize here is we need to take the word displacement seriously in writing a storyline or the history of Eritrea. I could have easily given the title "Choose Your Enemy," but I thought it would be better to put it as "Choose Your Audience," just to make it look safe. But as you can see here, all the wars are listed here. We have the first Italo-Ethiopian War, which is the Battle of Adwa, and we have the invasion of Libya. And there was this one, the Italian-Turkish War, in which Eritrean soldiers were part of, but we don't know much about that. And then you have the second Italo-Abyssinian War, which is 1935. As part of the Second World War to defeat fascist Italy. So this book here by Mackenzie, Captain Mackenzie, he says something about the Eritrean or the colonial troops. Talking about the Italian and Eritrean troops in Kenya. He says, moreover, the colonial troops, which are the Eritrean and Italian army, until they cracked at the very end, they fought with valor and resolution, and their staunchness was a testimony to the excellence of the Italian administration and military training in Eritrea. For me, that statement could be written now, and probably the Eritrean government or Eritrean administration, whatever we want to call it, one could say the same thing. This is the excellence of the government of Eritrea and the military training they provided to the young soldiers of Eritrea. And this is what almost says 70 years old, or almost 80 years old. And it just says a lot about Eritrea, really. I mean, the story of this country called Eritrea is about a military warfare that displaces its people generation after generation. In short, the intention of this paper is to stress the importance of reframing Eritrea's history with the idea of settlement and displacement. As you can see here, the settlement of Eritrea or Eritreans is a pie up in the sky, and unless the people of Eritrea or whoever is involved in Eritrea brings that settlement, this settlement, idea of settlement in Eritrea has probably never happened. And displacement will go on and on and on. And this picture says, in short, that this is the framework or the main frame by which Eritrea should be or can be perceived, and replace the old story that war is a good thing for Eritrea. Much could have been said about this, but this is just an attempt to introduce this framework of settlement and displacement in the making of the storyline of Eritrea. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gangul. Hannah, you would like to come here? So our moderator is already here now, so she will take over the rest of the programs. So go ahead.
All right. Hello. Next we have Hida Tagos, and she's presenting Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit, Women and Girls Stories of the War. Oh, next we have Miss Hida Tagos, and she is presenting a piece called Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit, Women and Girls Stories from the Tigray War. Alright. Hida Tagos Tuku is a multilingual expert. She has degrees in business management from Bahada University and a master's in hospitality and tourism from the University of Rovira e Virgili from Spain. A certified Spanish bilingual, she is fluent in Tigrinya, Spanish, Amharic, and English. Notable for authoring the first Tigrinya Spanish and Tigrinya Catalan dictionaries. Her most significant achievement is the translation and publication of the impactful book, Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit, Women and Girls Rape Stories from the Tigray War. This book is published on Amazon and has garnered attention not just for its literary merits, but also for its profound message that highlights the horrific atrocities committed against the women and girls of Tigray during the most recent Tigray War. It exposes the acts of violence perpetrated by Ethiopian forces, Amhara forces, and Eritrean forces during the Tigray War. In the wake of the Tigray conflict, Hida has used her linguistic expertise and her professional influence to support NGOs aiding the Tigray people and sharing their stories with the world. Hida?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. start this with thank everyone, the organizing committees for this very important symposium, for inviting me for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the women and girls of Tigray to those who has been the victims of the genocidal war in Tigray. So thank you. Today I will be presenting you this book, this article. Maybe you can see that the title is Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit, Women and Girls Rape Stories from the Tigray War. This book was first published in Tigrinya. The title in Tigrinya is Mekanit. Mekanit is a word, a Ge'ez word, which means a tool for punishment. The authors decided to give it this title because, as we all know, women and girls were used as a tool for the genocidal war in Tigray by the different forces, the Eritrean forces, Amhara forces, militias, and the Fanos, as well as the Ethiopian federal forces. They all took part in this horrific acts of genocide targeting the women and girls in Tigray. So the original authors of this book are Burhan and Nurse Mulu. You probably know them, especially Nurse Mulu was one of the people who gave her testimonies. The authors of this book are Burhan and Nurse Mulu. You probably know them, especially Nurse Mulu was sorry about that. And if the mic is working? Thank you. So as I said, the two women, Nurse Mulu and Burhan, who actually wrote this book in Tigrinya, I just want to thank them for their courage, because writing this book, I cannot even imagine. For me, translating this was one of the most traumatic experiences. So being with the victims, hearing the stories of those victims, and being able to write it and relive it again and again, I cannot even imagine it. So I just want to start by thanking them. So this Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit is a book that is comprised of 17 stories of the victims of the genocidal war in Tigray. All these 17 women who came from different walks of life, different age, different social life, different locations from all over Tigray, and the way they were raped was also different circumstances. It just represents how the rape was used as a weapon, as a tool for genocide, because it was deliberately done, it was pre-planned, it was done in a systematic way, and it just shows how it all shows it was purposely done in order to use as a genocide, as a means of eliminating the people of Tigray by mainly attacking the women. So again, those 17 women were attacked in the most horrific way. They all have different stories. So when this story covers their testimonies, it shows first about, for example, when we hear one story of one woman or a girl, it starts from the upbringing of this woman or girl. Who was she? What kind of aspirations she has? What kind of dreams she has? What did she live? What kind of life she had? Was she married? Was she a kid? And then it brings the war. It shows the details of how the war started and where was this woman. And then also it talks about the details of the rape. It's, as I said again, it's horrific. The details are very disturbing. So whoever reads the book, which you'll also find it on Amazon, I advise to be mindful because it's very traumatic, and just be mindful of where you read it. Take care of your mental health because this is something I personally, unlike anything that I have heard in my entire life, let alone to think that my people, my family actually went through it. So I just want to give that advice ahead of time. But also it's an important book when it comes to as a evidence of what exactly happened. We all know, we have seen in the news how the rape was being used as a weapon of war, but to hear it from the victims themselves and to know the details, every single detail of what exactly happened is another thing. We've heard since the beginning of the war how 120,000 women and girls were raped and gang raped most of the time, not just by one person, but also by many people at the same time and for many days. Many of them were held hostage. They were held hostage on many camps. The Eritrean soldiers' camps, the Amhara soldiers' camps, and the Ethiopians, and sometimes they all are together. So it just explains the details of most of the stories are similar. It just shows how the perpetrators, when they were committing this act of violence, it shows how they were given instruction on purpose. Sometimes they were told to, those who have HIV/AIDS, they were told to go ahead and infect all the women of Tigray, or at least those who can find. Some of them were told to make sure that they never give birth again. And some of them were told to cause them such kind of horrific acts of violence that it will result in a long-term traumatic experience that will not only damage the present generation, but also the future ones. So again, God points out how this rape was used as a means of weapon of war. In addition to blocking the food and destroying the medicine and hospitals and everything else, but this was purposely used as the first tool of genocide. So coming back to the stories of these 17 women, as I said, it starts by explaining their stories. Where did they grow up? What's their name? What kind of life did they have? And then when the details of the rape, and after that, the aftermath of the rape. What did they actually, what was their options when they wanted to go some treatment from the hospitals, which, as we know also, a lot of the health centers in the hospitals were destroyed also on purpose and completely. We know that 90% of the hospitals were not functional, while 85% was completely destroyed. There was no medicine. So when these women, after going through something inhuman, something which is difficult to explain, they didn't even have an option to be able to get treatment that they really deserved. Sometimes it shows the stories that they continue to walk and looking for a hospital or a health center or for someone to really see how if they can get any kind of treatment. Unfortunately, their options were almost none. In fact, these 17 women are the, we'll say, lucky ones because they were the ones that somehow managed to go to the Eider hospital, some of them to some hospital in Shire. But unfortunately, many of them did not even have that opportunity to be able to get treatment and to be able to get their stories and personal accounts, what exactly happened to them. Again, one of the saddest part is that to this day, there is no justice for this woman. No woman in this world has to go through what they went through. And what breaks the most, what breaks my heart is that there's not even justice. Nobody's being held accountable for what they did. So I just call for everyone, and especially for my brothers and sisters here from Eritrea, to help us look for justice. Because if these perpetrators don't get held accountable for what they did, there's no guarantee that it's not going to happen tomorrow. Humanity needs to learn from this. What happened is past. It's past. We've lost so many of them. In fact, some of those who actually, their story were covered here, did actually pass after the story was out. Most of them committed suicide because they could not handle the aftermath of their rape stories. And as you know, our community, unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma around women who are raped. And of course, we know the siege and the lack of treatment that they needed. So I just called most of the ladies, when they shared their stories, they were only sharing because they were hoping that somehow this would get out and somehow it would get in the hands of those who can help bring justice, so that it will never ever happen to anyone in this entire world. Humanity needs to learn from this mistake. Never ever should ever happen. So this is kind of a short description of what the book is about. I'm afraid I cannot go into the details because, as I say, first of all, it's very traumatic. But I also would like to, if an opportunity, if anyone wants to ask a specific question about the book, how it came about, or any kinds of technicality of the book, or what happened after it was published, or anything, I would be more than happy to answer. But I think this would do it for now, and I can stay here for answering any questions that you might have.
It's very, very important that is already documented. All right. This is very, very interesting story, and we should learn about this very well. And where do you have the book to buy? Can we buy it around in the United States?
Yes, thank you. The book is actually published in Amazon. So if you actually search "Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit, Women and Girls Rape Stories from the Tigray War," you will find it. One thing that I forgot to mention is that the title itself, "Tearing the Body, Breaking the Spirit," we were looking for a title that would capture the whole thing, because it was not actually not the physical body that was punished and violated and doing all these horrific things on, but it was like the spirit, especially when we see the details of the aftermath of the stories of these women, what they went through, their mental health and everything. We can see how the spirit was actually broken. So we just want to include in the title that it's breaking the body physically, but at the same time also breaking the spirit of the human being. So I just want to add that piece.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone on Zoom have any more questions for Hidat? Okay, we'll get to you in a second. Anyone on Zoom have a question for Hidat? No? Okay. What's your question?
English or Tigrinya? I don't know.
Let's do English. Oh.
Okay. First, thank you so much for your hard work and efforts to come up with this whole research. My question to you, do you have some women following you, working with you, such like organizations? And what is your plans, future plans? What are you going to do? And the second is, what about the Tigray government? What are they thinking and what are they going to do? We would like to know. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. All right. Thank you again to Hidat. Oh.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question. To answer the first question, my involvement on this project or on this book was to translate it. I am a certified medical interpreter, so it's something that I do. And when I think of ways to be a voice to my people, I thought this could be a good opportunity. Hopefully this can become a piece of evidence towards the justice and accountability for the genocidal violence crime. And so that was my involvement. So I'm now really part of any organization that is specifically assisting the victims. But I do know that there are a lot of organizations which are working towards rehabilitation and treatment centers for these women. In fact, the sale of this book is 100% going towards those centers. There is so many of them. Tigray Action Committee is one of them, who are actually, the money is going to them so they can support many of the centers in Tigray. The original authors of Insigrinia, Burhan, and Nurse Mulu are the ones who are really involved because they are on the ground and they get to see the victims, they get to talk to them, and they kind of try to empower them and help them towards the healing and rehabilitation of these women. So that is the answer for the first one. And unfortunately, I don't know much about what the Tigray government is doing. Like many diasporas, I live here, so I don't. This book actually, and I know they do beyond that, they do many things. So that is one organization. HPN for Tigray has a network for Tigray. They do also do a lot of medical related treatments and also mental health therapies and stuff like that. So I know that they work a lot of, they have a lot of projects on the ground in Tigray. So I would strongly suggest anyone to donate, help out and involved with HPN for Tigray and Tigray Action Committee. Those are among many other organizations. I know that in Sudan, for example, which we actually also have a lot of those victims, Asmalash Grant is one of the foundations that I know they do an amazing job by helping the victims out there.
From the Horn of Africa, so
Are you there, Mr. John? John Young, are you there? Yeah, it's muted. Yeah, your mic is muted. Okay, great.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Can you see me?
Thank you. Yes, we can see you.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. Thank you very much. Just rushing off for a second. Anyway, let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I was very impressed by the number of people speaking and their commitment. And I certainly heartily endorse the theme of the topic, theme of the session on regime change. Although I hasten to ask to note that one of the messages I got said, and I think it was a Freudian slip, it said region change, not regime change. But I think I can endorse that as well. I think there needs to be change throughout the entire region, not just in Eritrea. What I want to speak to or about is the international dimensions here. I want to, I guess, bring a concern to the importance of the very marked changes internationally. Attention to this. Let me begin by making just a
Recording in progress.
Okay, to make some brief comments on the history of how we got here. And it has to be noted that, of course, under both the EPLF and the ELF before it, the wars were conducted during the period of the Cold War. And the assumption was that Eritrea would gain its independence during a period of multipolarity. And in fact, the EPLF itself, although it was effectively involved or subject to a proxy war through the Derg that was sponsored by or supported by the Eastern Bloc, the attitude of the EPLF was one that this was in fact an aberration of the Soviet bloc or the Eastern Bloc, and that Eritrea would find its place in a socialist multipolar world when it gained its independence. In the event, it was quite the opposite. Eritrea achieved power immediately after, the collapse of the socialist bloc and the start of a period of U.S. hegemony, and that has very much shaped the future course of the country. regime. And that would not be mistaken at all. Moreover, we see the opportunism on the side of Moscow and Beijing in defending a state like Eritrea. But what we're really talking about here is the growing conflict between essentially Russia and China on one side and the collective West on the other, and their desire for allies, no matter what the political complexion of the regime involved. But this really misses the point. After all, opportunism is hardly unknown in international politics. And what is really at stake is that the US is no longer the global hegemon. And a multipolar world is emerging that is increasingly centered on China and Russia. In 1991, when the TPLF, when the EPLF came to power, it had little option but to deal with the realities of the international configuration of power, which put the US in a dominant position. But now the situation is completely different, and the regime can play a very different kind of game internationally. So the TPLF and the EPLF begrudgingly in 1991 accepted that reality, but that is no longer the case. That period in history has ended, and that's the significance of the period that we're entering in now, and which has to be paid very close attention to, I think, by the Eritrean opposition. And we just have to look within the region, including the Middle East, because as we've seen in Eritrea, we certainly see it even more in Sudan, but also in Ethiopia, is that the Middle Eastern politics and their concerns have very much influenced and shaped developments in the Horn of Africa. And in fact, many people now consider the Middle East and the Horn of Africa effectively one security unit. That's the situation we've emerged in. And when we look at that, and we look at the role of China, the changes that we see just become incredibly significant. We now see that the BRICS countries, only 5 of them at this stage, now have, in terms of purchasing power, more, a greater percentage of the GNP than the G7 do. And all of the projections, wherever you're looking from, World Bank, IMF, suggest a rapid divergence with the BRICS countries becoming increasingly dominant and the G7 countries increasingly declining. We also see that BRICS now has 18 new candidate members who want to join, and I think it's very significant for Eritreans that a number of those key ones are effectively neighbors of Eritrea. And that includes Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, and Iran. And of course, just a couple of weeks ago, Ethiopia announced its intention as well to apply for membership in BRICS. So we see the significance of this. China is now the biggest trading partner of almost every country in the Horn and in the Middle East, and in fact in Africa as a whole. It is now the biggest source of investment in virtually every country in the Middle East and in the Horn. 46 countries in Africa have now signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. China has 5 times the amount of trade with Africa as the US. Just think about that, 5 times as much. It wasn't very long ago when it was completely the opposite. And China has invested 2.5 times as much in African infrastructure as all of the West combined. So that gives you a sense of the economic power that China has and how much it's displacing the US. But that economic power is also increasingly impacting its political power and capacity. And if we look at the Middle East in particular, we can see that up until very recently, that with the notable exception of Eritrea, that virtually every country in the Middle East could be considered a client state of the US. Well, that is clearly no longer the case. And what we've seen just in the last few months is China's crucial role in bringing a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that, I think, was largely possible because of the changing economic position of China in the Middle East. Because until recently, the US was the major importer of oil from the Middle East. That's no longer the case. China is the biggest importer of petroleum in the world.
Hello, my name is you're the one calling this morning. This is you guys.
And two of it, getting disturbed by an iPhone is big. Anyway, to go back to what I was saying, is that China had a genuine interest in resolving this conflict because Iran and Saudi Arabia, along with Russia, were the three major sources for its oil. So peace was in its interest. And that makes an interesting contrast with the United States, because for the last 40 years, the United States has perpetuated the conflict, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's effectively divided much of the Middle East between the Sunni states and the Shia states, and projecting its interest. And then we also see the dramatic changes in Syria, again, just within the last few months. And we saw that the West had supported regime change in Syria. It had used its client states, or its client states had cooperated with it in these efforts. It involved supporting a whole series of terrorist groups in Syria, which are still there. But essentially through the military intervention of Russia, all of this has changed. And we saw just in May, just a couple of months ago, that Syria has now been readmitted to the Middle East mainstream, into the Arab League again. This is a dramatic change of development. So we see the whole Middle East taking on a different political complexion. So it's hard to exaggerate the significance of that, not only for the Middle East, but globally. It speaks very powerfully to how the world is changing, of how there is a multipolar world coming to the fore. Now, while the evidence of the political power of China and Russia in the Middle East is very clear, it's not quite as clear in the Horn of Africa, but what we do see in the Horn of Africa is the declining power of the US. And first of all, we see that Russia has replaced the US as being the major supplier of weapons. And of course, it already was the major supplier of grains and fertilizers to Africa and much of the rest of the world as well. We also see that the United States is no longer able to control the actions of what were its client states in the Middle East. We saw their engagement in the Ethiopian War most dramatically. We saw their engagement in Sudan, where they're all over the place in Sudan, and they frequently were operating against US interests, but the US was in no position to do anything about that. I think I'm getting a bit long. Am I getting a bit,
Yeah. If you could
Okay.
wrap it up, you have only 2 to 3 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, okay, I can do it in 2 or 3 minutes. At any rate, the message from all of this should be fairly clear. And the message is, or what the takeaway is that the world has changed. And that in context now, where as the subject of this symposium is about regime change, there's a logic in the Middle East, which is a very unfortunate one, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. and in a context where the United States has signaled that it is in fact in favor of regime change, there will certainly be people who will argue that a natural alliance is between the opposition and the United States. But I would argue that that completely would be based on a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of the realities of the situation, and that the opposition should look much more carefully at that situation. I have more to say, but I realize I've gone over my limit here, so thank you very much for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Young?
Sorry.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Young? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Yang, for your presentation. But I have a question for you. How reliable is this BRICS a new phenomena to be successful economically or strategically? How do you undermine the US power or economic power, in short? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And what we're looking at is clearly a project that is still in the making. I think it's actually this month, where BRICS are coming together, and they're actually going to discuss the criteria for taking in new members. But I think I'm speaking more broadly to the changes that have gone on in the international community, where we actually see the rise of what is being called the global South economically. One only has to look at the kind of economic, it's not so much economic decline of the US, but again, the rise of the South. At the end of the Second World War, the United States constituted 50% of the global GDP. And now it's 15%, and it's declining. And much of that has been taken up by China, India, Brazil, these other countries. So the change is already there. There's no question about that. The crucial issue is whether these groups like BRICS or the Shanghai Conference or even the non-alignment movement can operate politically in a coherent way. And I think that's the challenge, I think, for people in the global South. But I think the other thing to be said is an alliance with the US always means the same thing. It means subservience to the US. And you only have to look at what's happened the last couple of years or the last year in Sudan, where Sudan had a transitional government, which was probably the most pro-American government in the history of Sudan under Abdullah Hamdok. And what was the response of the Americans? Was not to welcome them into the international community, not to talk about democracy, but quite the opposite. To demand that they recognize Israel against their own wishes, a proposition which has been rejected by every government in Sudan. And then furthermore, to force this very weak government of Abdullah Hamdok to pay $335 million for the supposed crimes of the Bashir government in the bombing of the USS Cole and the bombings of the US embassies in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, which clearly the transitional government had absolutely nothing to do with. But it suggests that any kind of alliance with the US, you're necessarily going to be in a situation like that. And I would have thought that for a country or people like the Eritreans who fought 30 years of a very aggressive, violent war for their independence and their national sovereignty, would be subject to American neo-colonialism or that kind of control would be unacceptable. I think the way forward is through the non-alignment movement. And I would remind you that Russia and China both support the national non-alignment movement, and the United States from its inception has been opposed to the non-alignment movement.
Thank you. All right.
So let's clap to Mr. John Young, please. Outside of the room.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so next we have Dan Connell, who's here with us today. He is a journalist, an aid professional, an author, and a university professor with a focus on Eritrea that spans 5 decades. He retired from teaching journalism and African politics at Simmons University in 2014, consulted for the Norway Foreign Ministry on Refugees and Peace in the Horn of Africa in 2014 to 2020, and has been a visiting researcher at Boston University's African Studies Center since 2011. His books include Against All Odds, a chronicle of the Eritrean Revolution, Rethinking Revolution, Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners, the Historical Dictionary, Historical Dictionary of Eritrea, and an updated edition of Against All Odds with the reprisal of the country and its leadership in 2021. His most recent travel to the region was in March and April of 2023, and he is now working on a book on Eritrean refugee experiences, so.
Thank you very much. So I was asked to speak on the G15 and the impact of that and the significance of it in Eritrean history and politics. And so I'm going to really start by going back a little bit into where I think the party that ran the EPLF, the EPRP, came from and what it did. What Eritrea looked like under EPLF in the 70s and 80s, and then what it looks like today. I had a book, Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners, which I wanted to point out to you guys. There we are. Hi, John. Oops. Wait a minute, technical issue here. Okay, now we've got it. So I wanted to just mention the Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners, which was cited among my books. It was published in 2004. And it's transcripts of interviews that I did with the people that became political prisoners, of course. They weren't when I talked to them, but Haile Wolfensai Duro, Mahmoud Sharifo, let's see, Petros Solomon, Ogba Abraham, and Brahane Gabezgavir. In 2000 and 2001, leading up to their arrest and the purge of the G15. I'm going to come back to the book at the end of the talk, but let's see. Let me just take you back a little bit through my history. This is 1977, my second trip into Eritrea. The first time I came in was in 1976 with the EPLF and the ELF. I first went with EPLF for, I believe it was 2 weeks, and then came back out with ELF for 2 weeks. We switched in Wakitaba. And I came back again in 1977 and spent 6 months in the field with EPLF. What I saw when I was there was the organization of the front and the activities they were involved in that were not military. There were the underground workshops that were famous, of course, in many ways at the time. The ELF had them too, but these are just the EPLF in that period. And they were repairing weapons here. They also made uniforms, medicine, and other things. This was in FA. There were training camps. The women and the men were trained separately. There were also barefoot doctors and a public health system that was in its infancy then. They had clinics, remote clinics in different parts of the liberated zones. And they also had these barefoot doctors, as they're called, these backpacking paramedics mostly, who went around teaching sanitation, hygiene, and basic curative medicine. And they also ran schools. This was in Zaire in 1977, where they had curricula that was in several different Eritrean languages that they produced in the field in one of those underground workshops. And behind this, they had a highly politicized front that was, in this case, doing a study out of the little orange book, I would call it. Wait a minute. This was the political manual, really, for the party that was operating inside EPLF at the time, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. Very few people were aware of this who were not members, although there was a suspicion throughout the front that there might be a party. But it was a secret party operating within the front. The person who was behind it was Haile Tensai, whom I met in his tent, really, in the base area. This is an organizational chart behind him. And I was interviewing him here about the role of the cadre school, which was basically the training ground for the party members who went out into the front. Okay. Petros Solomon this is in Nakba. He was the commander of the Nakba front for a period. But they were, of course, key in the G15. I also met the big guy there. You've probably seen this photograph. That's Azaz and his bunker in Nakba. And while I was there, I was asking if I could, actually this is 1979, I wanted to go behind the lines to see what the EPLF was doing in the highlands, in Kabasa, after the withdrawal. Because the world, the media were saying, this struggle's over. And it wasn't. And I knew it wasn't, but I had to go there and see it for myself to report on it to be convincing. So I got permission to go. And I went up, while we walked around Alphabet, we walked up through Gelib, down to Shed, to Filfil, up through Salamona, and outside Asmara, looking in. What I found there was what I had seen before, and that was that the fighters were dug in many places along the way. The government then, the Ethiopian administration, the occupation forces, held the towns, and they used the roads by day, but by night they were being used by the two fronts. There were again improvised schools, and there was medical care. Again, this is walking up to the highlands after a strafing. And of course, there was the famine that came in the mid-'80s that held back the struggle. But once again, the front was very well organized, very efficient. And this was something that was a function of the role of the party, I think, within the front. The party shaped the attitude, the behavior of many of the members through its own teachings and example. With some mixed results, as I'm learning from reading Mesfin Hagos's memoir that's out now. which I'll come back to too. It's an African revolution, the reclaiming an African revolution. But in 1991, after the independence, people also came back by the hundreds from outside, some for a short period, some for longer periods to help rebuild the country. And I point that out because the contrast with what happened in 2018 when Eritrea and Ethiopia made peace, or at least Abiy and Isaias did, was striking. Instead of people coming back, more people left. So the volunteerism of that era is gone. I think you don't see much of this anymore, except you see national service. This was Amadero. This was the community coming out and building that dam on a volunteer basis. But in 1998, as already been said, of course, this was the next round of war. This was Sorona, where I was in 1998 and 1999, to witness the fight. And then, of course, people were back in the bunkers. This is a scene from right outside Sorona. Could have been Nakba in the 1970s, and it could be Eritrea today. In 2001 and 2002, of course, the door shut. Figuratively, this is my figurative door, but of course it shut on discussion of this, criticism of the war, and criticism of the government. So now, political repression really took hold during the war and afterward. It was there before and it was there during the liberation struggle. But it substantially increased in 98 to 2000 during the border war, so-called. I put that in quotes because I think it was really a political struggle and not a border war. But Eritrea lost that war basically in the end, as Ethiopia broke through the mountains and took over at least a quarter of the Eritrean territory before they were blocked from getting onto Asmara. Criticism of Isaias' leadership grew up during that time within the front. And I started talking with Haile Woltetsai, the first conversation in the book that I mentioned, conversations with Eritrean prisoners, political prisoners, took place in January of 2000, between the second and third round of the war with Ethiopia. And in it, I started asking Haile, what was the role of the EPRP and how did it affect things? Because I was seeing what looked like the same kind of government now as I had seen in the 70s. And there is and was an inner circle doing much of the leadership in the post-war period too, the post-independence period. But in the lead up to that, in 2000, there was criticism inside the front in the Central Committee of the PFDJ, as it was then called, and within the National Assembly. And that's detailed in Messon's book in an interesting way. So I really recommend it if you want to go back to this period to see what was going on with Isaias and how he managed to set the stage. Of 2001, and Messon was one of them. But the other 11 were arrested and have disappeared. After that, the press was shut down and hundreds more were arrested throughout the country. This left the Constitution unimplemented in 1997, national elections indefinitely postponed, and all parties and independent organizations banned, except for those run by the PFDJ and its satellites, the various unions. In April 2002, the ban was expanded to include unsanctioned religious groups. Next. But the political culture of Eritrea's ruling party has been set from the earliest days in the 1970s. It's always been an authoritarian one, predicated upon the exercise of power by a small number of people operating in secret, basically. And that was justified in a certain way during the struggle. But it transformed the leadership in ways that continued afterward. And the political culture was really set for the 90s. It was handpicked by Isaias and not accountable to a base. And I'm talking about the leadership of PFDJ in 1994. Okay, one more slide. So I want to go through a timeline of Isaias's takeover. And I could actually go back to the 1970s and the different crackdowns that took place within EPLF then on Unka and Yamin, but 1987 was decisive. He shook up the EPLF leadership then. He changed the leadership of the party also, bringing in new Central Committee members from the armed forces that were loyal to him. And they, in turn, were then part of the political bureau of the EPLF. The party CC was basically the core of the EPLF's executive function, the executive committee. Power throughout this time. There was nominally a structure, an institutional structure, but he went around it whenever it suited him. So he had a minister of defense, but he went around it to deal directly with the generals when he wanted to. And he actually, in the in the border war with Ethiopia, he actually ran many of the decisions of individual units. He's a micromanager, of course. But in 97, his refusal to implement a ratified constitution was decisive. I think the Constitution has all kinds of problems, and I'm not pushing it as the model constitution. But it was a step, at least, that would put some curbs on his power, and he refused to implement it. Then you had the border war. As was laid out earlier, that border war came after several other wars. With Yemen, of course, the Hanish Islands, almost with Sudan in 1994. And then finally with Djibouti, of course. So in effect, during that period, Isaias waged war with all of his neighbors at one time or another, and mostly without the input of other cabinet members who were just a showpiece for his need for an institutional representation. In fact, there was an inner core of people who were making the decisions, and they were, just like before, a clandestine group who shifted a bit and was not the collective leadership that there had been, nor were they accountable to a membership as the party had been. So there's a steady narrowing of Isaias's control all the way up through the 80s and 90s until finally he gets protest in 2000 by the PFDJ. Dissidents, I'm calling them, Messon calls them reformers. In May and September of that year, for months and months. The G15, whom I was interviewing some of in the lead up to that, knew that this was coming. And one of the last things they did was to publish a manifesto in August of 2001. I really recommend that to people because it lays out not just a critique of the past that the open letter had, but a vision of the future, what they saw as Eritrea's future, what it could have been. And I just want to, one more slide here. No, it's got to go, yeah, one more, there it is. The August 3rd manifesto, which I think is one of the most important documents of that period, was published in one of the Eritrean, the Asmara newspapers. I think it was Sati. It looked to the future and it called for changing the policy of Eritrea toward Ethiopia, Sudan, and Yemen to increase security and trade and end support for arms.